There's a secret about the Ottoman Empire they never taught you. Not all sultans ruled with the sword. Some were ruled by whispers, by letters, by a woman's hand. Mihrimah Sultan, Ottoman princess, who bent an empire with gifts and grit. She was not a queen, not a sultana who sat upon the throne, but she pulled the strings of those who did. Born the only daughter of Suleiman the Magnificent and the legendary Hürrem Sultan, Mihrimah was the empire's golden child, but behind her radiant smile lay steel. She gave gifts that were more powerful than armies, and she bent the will of viziers and sultans alike. She shaped wars, financed mosques, and determined who lived on, who died. The empire called her moon and sun, but the truth, she was a storm wrapped in silk, a shadow behind Suleiman's throne. It begins in Istanbul, 1522. The Bosphorus shimmered under the sun. This was the city of Suleiman the Magnificent, who dreamed of Rome itself. But within Topkapi Palace, beyond marble courtyards and gilded chambers, a child was born who would outlast battles, and in some ways outshine even her father. Her name was Mihrimah, sun and moon, a name chosen not only for beauty, but for destiny. She was the only daughter of Suleiman and Hürrem Sultan, the infamous Roxolana, a concubine who became queen. From her mother, Mihrimah inherited ambition, and from her father, the weight of empire. Picture her childhood, raised among silken cushions, the scent of rosewater in the air, eunuchs bowing low at her passing. But behind the luxury was constant danger. The Ottoman court was a crucible of power. Brothers turned on brothers, viziers plotted, concubines schemed, and Mihrimah, even as a child, watched it all unfold. At 7, she could recite poetry in Persian. At 10, she debated philosophy with scholars. At 12, she listened as her mother whispered strategies to Suleiman late at night. Secrets carried through walls as thin as paper. She was a girl, yes, but she was learning the language of power. Then came her first taste of danger. In 1529, as Suleiman marched on Vienna, rumors swept through the harem. If the Sultan fell in battle, the empire would fracture. Mihrimah, barely a girl, heard the silence of her mother's chambers at night, the silence of a woman calculating survival. And she realized crowns were not secured by armies alone. They were secured by influence. By the time Mihrimah reached 16, she was ready to step into her role. Her marriage would be no small affair. She was wed to Rustam Pasha, the Grand Vizier himself, in a union that bound her directly to the machinery of state. Imagine the wedding, the Bosphorus alive with lanterns, ships firing cannons in celebration, the city dazzled by gold and silk. But behind the spectacle was strategy, with her husband controlling the viziers, her father ruling the empire, and her mother whispering in the harem. Mihrimah became the third pillar of a triangle that shaped the Ottoman world, and she knew how to use her position. Gifts were her weapon. Mihrimah understood that a jeweled dagger could win more loyalty than an army of janissaries. She distributed silks, coin, and jewels to allies, binding them in networks of gratitude. But her gifts were never random. Each one was chosen, calculated, a thread in a web that stretched from Istanbul to Damascus. From Belgrade to Cairo, her influence deepened during the 1540s. When Suleiman's armies faced crisis in Hungary, war drained the treasury, rebellions smoldered, and whispers of dissent spread among viziers. It was Mihrimah who stepped forward. She donated her immense wealth to fund campaigns. Her dowry turned into soldiers' pay. Imagine the astonishment of generals when the Sultan announced that the princess had financed their march. Her name was no longer just a symbol of beauty, it was power. But here comes the twist. With every coin she gave, every mosque she commissioned, every ally she rewarded, she was carving a place for herself in history. Unlike the sultans who ruled with swords, she ruled with the unseen currency of loyalty and obligation. If you were there, a janissary marching under Suleiman's banner, and you learned your wages came not from the treasury, but from the sultan's daughter, would you not whisper her name with reverence, perhaps even with fear? Mihrimah's power was not only financial. She became a trusted advisor to her father. Letters survive, graceful, diplomatic, but sharp, with insight, where she counseled Suleiman on foreign wars. She knew the empire's greatest threat was not always beyond its borders, but within the palace itself, and her mother's shadow loomed large. Hürrem Sultan, once a concubine, now queen, taught Mihrimah that love was a weapon, that loyalty could be bought, and that survival required ruthlessness. The mother whispered, the daughter listened, and together they shaped Suleiman's decisions in ways no council of viziers ever could. But this was only the beginning. For as Suleiman's reign grew darker with age, and the empire's succession grew uncertain, Mihrimah would become more than a daughter and wife. She would become the power that stood between empire and chaos, and her gifts, those glittering, carefully chosen gifts, would prove sharper than any blade. The Ottoman dynasty glittered on the outside, but inside its gilded walls, it was a serpent's nest. For in the Ottoman world, succession was never simple, never peaceful. Brothers were not allies, they were rivals, and only one could survive. Mihrimah Sultan knew this better than anyone. She had watched from the harem as her father's court grew tense whenever the question of succession arose. Suleiman the Magnificent had many sons, but which of them would inherit his throne? The choice would decide the empire's fate, and Mihrimah knew that her role was not passive. Her survival, her family's survival, depended on whom she supported. Two names dominated the whispers: Prince Mustafa, the eldest, beloved by the army, admired by the people, respected across the empire, and Prince Selim, younger, softer, known more for wine and poetry than for war. If bloodline were the only measure, Mustafa was the natural heir, but Mihrimah's mother, Hürrem Sultan, feared him. For Mustafa was not her son. He was the son of another consort, a rival bloodline that could sweep away all that Hürrem had built. And so the harem split. Factions formed around Mustafa, factions around Selim, and in the middle stood Mihrimah, daughter of Suleiman and Hürrem, sister to Selim. She could not stand apart. She had to choose. Picture the scene, a secret council at night, within the scented chambers of Hürrem Sultan, incense thick in the air, curtains drawn tight. Hürrem speaks in low tones, her eyes burning. If Mustafa inherits, she tells her daughter, we are finished. He will see us as rivals, and rivals do not live long in this palace. Mihrimah nods. She knows it is true, but to oppose Mustafa is to oppose the army itself. It is to challenge destiny. Yet Mihrimah has her own weapons, her gifts, her alliances, her influence over Suleiman himself. She writes letters, subtle but sharp, warning of Mustafa's ambition. She whispers to viziers, reminding them of the wealth and favor that flow through her hands. Slowly, she bends the court's mood. Suspicion grows. Mustafa, once seen as the shining heir, begins to appear dangerous, too ambitious, too popular. And in an empire where the sultan's will is law, popularity is a crime. The climax comes in 1553 during the campaign against Persia. The Ottoman army camps beneath the Anatolian sun, banners fluttering, soldiers sharpening their blades. Suleiman summons Mustafa. The prince enters the tent, bowing low, confident, unaware that death waits for him. At a signal, the mutes of the court seize him, silken cords wrapping around his throat. He struggles, but the cords tighten. In moments, the empire's most beloved prince is gone. The camp falls silent. Soldiers weep openly. Some curse under their breath, but none dare rebel against the will of the sultan. And in Istanbul, within Topkapi Palace, Mihrimah and her mother breathe easier. Their rival is dead. Selim's path to the throne is clear, but the victory is tainted. The people whisper that Hürrem and Mihrimah plotted Mustafa's fall. Poets mourn the slain prince, blaming the harem's intrigues. And though Selim is now heir, he lacks his brother's charisma, his strength, his honor. Mihrimah has won the game, but at a price. If you were there, standing among the janissaries who loved Mustafa, watching him led to his death, what would you have done? Would you have dared to speak, knowing silence meant survival? Or would you have cursed the names of the women in the palace, whispering that the empire's greatest warrior was lost to their schemes? After Mustafa's death, the empire shifted. Suleiman grew colder, darker. Hürrem aged, her health failing, and into the void stepped Mihrimah. With her mother gone, she became her father's closest confidant. Letters between them show her advising him on campaigns, on foreign alliances, even on matters of the heart. No woman since Hürrem wielded such influence. Her power grew even more visible in the city itself. Mihrimah commissioned mosques, grand, soaring works of architecture that reshaped the skyline of Istanbul. Sinan, the empire's greatest architect, built 2 mosques for her, one at Topkapi, one at Üsküdar. They were not just places of worship, they were monuments to her legacy, gifts to the people that carried her name into eternity. And yet, shadows still lingered. Selim, her brother, was weak. He drank, he stumbled, he lacked his father's fire. Would he be able to rule? Could Mihrimah protect him as she had protected her mother's legacy? Or would another rival rise, as Mustafa once had, to threaten everything she had built? Mihrimah had survived plots, shaped succession, and secured her brother's path. But the empire was changing, and the twilight of Suleiman's reign would test her in ways even she could not yet imagine. By the mid-1560s, the empire's glittering heart beat slower. Suleiman, the Magnificent, once the unstoppable lawgiver, once the man who had shaken Christendom at Vienna's gates, was now an old man. His beard was white, his gait slow, his eyes haunted. He had buried his beloved Hürrem. He had executed his most promising son, Mustafa, and his victories had become rarer, harder to win. And through it all, Mihrimah stood by his side in the palace halls of Topkapi. The courtiers whispered. The princess had become her father's closest advisor. She brought him letters. She listened to his grief. She reminded him of duty when sorrow threatened to pull him under. He trusted her as he trusted no one else. If you had walked through the palace gardens, you might have seen them, together an aging lion and his daughter, the sun and moon who illuminated his final years. But outside the palace, storms gathered. The empire was stretched thin. In Hungary, Christian powers plotted. In the east, Persia stirred restlessly. The treasury strained under the weight of endless war. And within, the question of succession gnawed like a worm in the heart of an apple. Selim the son, Mihrimah, had fought so hard to protect, was next in line. But he was not his father. Where Suleiman had discipline, Selim had indulgence. Where Suleiman had charisma, Selim had hesitation. He preferred the wine cup to the sword, the pleasures of the harem to the rigors of command. And though Mihrimah loved her brother, she knew the truth. The empire could not rest on his shoulders alone. It was in these twilight years that Mihrimah revealed her grit most clearly. She became more than a daughter, more than a sister. She became the quiet guardian of the dynasty itself. In 1566, Suleiman launched his final campaign against Hungary. Old, ill, and frail, he insisted on leading his armies once more. Some say it was pride. Others say it was despair. A man searching for one last blaze of glory before death claimed him. Mihrimah begged him not to go. She knew the risks. But Suleiman was resolute. The empire, he told her, was forged by the sword. It must never be seen without it. He departed, leaving Mihrimah in Istanbul, her letters chasing after him across the Balkans. Each one carried words of counsel, words of comfort, words of warning. And then, in September of that year, the inevitable came. At the siege of Shigetfer, as cannon thundered and smoke choked the air, Suleiman the Magnificent breathed his last. His death was kept secret for weeks. The army could not know their sultan was gone. The viziers feared mutiny, collapse. So they propped up his body in his tent, issuing decrees in his name, while silence spread like a shroud across the battlefield. And in Istanbul, when the truth finally arrived, Mihrimah wept. Her father, the lion of the empire, was gone. But there was no time for grief. For now her brother Selim was sultan, and the weight of empire rested upon him. Mihrimah understood what that meant. She must be his strength, his advisor, his shield. Without her, Selim would stumble. Without her, the empire might fracture. She threw herself into politics with renewed fury. She used her immense wealth to finance the state, pouring coin into the treasury when Selim's excesses drained it. She commissioned architects, poets, and generals, ensuring that her name, her influence, her name carved into the very stones of Istanbul. One story survives of this period, a story that reveals the depth of her power. When Selim prepared to march against Cyprus, he hesitated. The cost was great, the risk immense. But Mihrimah pressed him. She argued that the Venetians were weak, that Cyprus would enrich the empire, that to falter would invite enemies to strike. Selim, indecisive, eventually agreed. The campaign was launched, and though it brought blood and hardship, it also brought the empire new lands. Whose victory was it, truly Selim's or his sister's? But for every triumph, shadows lurked. Selim's indulgences worsened. He drank heavily, his judgment clouded. He surrounded himself with flatterers, men who whispered what he wanted to hear. And Mihrimah, watching from the sidelines, must have felt dread gnaw at her heart. She had sacrificed so much to put him on the throne. Would he undo everything? Her own health began to fail, in these years. The years of intrigue, of endless strain, weighed upon her. She had outlived her mother, her father, her rivals. She had watched the empire rise to glory and begin its slow descent. And though her body weakened, her will did not. Until her final breath, she fought to hold the dynasty together. If you were there, watching Mihrimah in her later years, draped in silks but with weary eyes, would you have called her powerful or tragic? Was she the savior of her brother's throne, or a woman who gave everything for an empire that never truly belonged to her? Her story did not end with Suleiman's death. It only grew heavier, for in the reign of her brother Selim, Mihrimah would fight one last battle not with swords or armies, but with the grit that had defined her life. The court of Selim II was not like that of his father, where Suleiman's halls echoed with the footsteps of warriors and poets. Selim's throbbed with music, wine, and laughter that often felt forced. The Sultan who came to be known as Selim the Sot lacked the fire of conquest, the vision of law, the steel that had made his father magnificent. Yet, in the shadows of Topkapi, one figure still stood as a pillar of strength. She had inherited the grit of Hürrem and the intelligence of Suleiman, and she knew that survival in this new court required more than loyalty. Mihrimah had pushed for it, knowing the Venetians' weakness. In 1570, Ottoman fleets surged across the Mediterranean, banners snapping, cannons booming. The island fell, but the victory came at a cost. At Lepanto, in 1571, the Holy League struck back, shattering the Ottoman navy in one of history's greatest sea battles. Istanbul reeled. Whispers filled the bazaars. Had the empire's luck ended with Suleiman? But even in the face of disaster, Mihrimah acted. She poured her wealth into rebuilding the fleet, financing new ships, new weapons, new campaigns. She reminded the empire that the sun and moon still shone. Even if Selim faltered, her gifts became lifelines. Coins flowed from her treasury to soldiers' wages. Jewels passed quietly into the hands of viziers who might have turned against her brother. Mosques rose on the city's hillsides, not only as places of worship, but as monuments of endurance. She was giving Istanbul more than buildings. She was giving it hope. But behind the gifts lay grit, and behind grit lay sacrifice. For every coin she gave, her own fortune dwindled. For every alliance she forged, new enemies stirred. The Venetian War left scars, not only on the empire, but on her own spirit. She had fought to shield her brother, but he gave little in return. Selim's court was filled with flatterers, concubines, and men who resented his sister's influence. Some whispered openly, "The princess rules, not the sultan," and perhaps they were right. In 1574, Selim's body gave way to his vices. After a night of drunken revelry, he slipped in his bathhouse and struck his head. Days later, the sultan was dead. He left behind little but debts and disarray. Mihrimah felt the blow not only as a sister, but as a guardian. For now, her nephew, Murad III, was to ascend, and the cycle of uncertainty began again. She was older, her health failing, yet she knew she could not rest. Not while the empire tottered. Not while the legacy of her father's house was at stake. Murad was young, inexperienced, and easily swayed. The court seethed with rival factions. Viziers jostled for influence. Concubines whispered in the shadows. Mihrimah, though aged, stepped once more into the storm. She offered counsel. She gave gifts. She stabilized what she could, yet each effort drained her more. She had spent her life bending the empire with her wealth and will. Now the empire was bending her. If you were there, standing in the courtyard of Topkapi, as Selim's body was carried out, would you have thought of the Sultan or of the princess who had truly kept the empire alive through his reign? By the late 1570s, Mihrimah's health was in decline, but she was not finished. Her greatest legacy still rose upon Istanbul's hills. The mosques, designed for her by the master architect Mimar Sinan at Topkapi, her mosque stood against the city's walls, commanding the horizon. At Üsküdar, another bore her name, gazing across the waters toward the palace of her birth. They were not merely buildings, they were stone testaments to her endurance, her gifts to the empire she had guarded for decades. Sinan himself, legend says, had loved her. His devotion to her infused his work, giving her monuments a beauty that outlasted politics, outlasted bloodshed. When she walked through the courtyards of her mosques, hearing the call to prayer echo against marble and dome, perhaps she smiled, for in those stones she had carved a permanence no sultan's weakness could erase. But her body was failing. The empire she had propped up for so long moved on, slowly forgetting the woman who had bent it with her generosity and grit. In 1578, after years of quiet suffering, Mihrimah Sultan breathed her last. She was buried near her father in Suleimani Mosque, close to the lion whose empire she had guarded. Her passing left a silence. Istanbul mourned not only a princess, but a protector. She had outlived her parents, her husband, her rivals. She had seen the empire at its greatest height, and she had held it steady as decline began. Yet even in death, her story was not finished. For Mihrimah Sultan had left more than monuments. She had left a legacy of female power in an empire that denied it, and her name would echo in stories, in legends, in the whispered awe of those who remembered the princess who bent an empire. But how would history judge her? As a loyal daughter, a shrewd advisor, a schemer in silks, or as the last great woman of Suleiman's golden age? The answer, perhaps, lay not in history books, but in the shadows she left behind. When Mihrimah Sultan's body was laid to rest in 1578, the sun and moon, who had carried the dynasty through storm and shadow, was gone. But as with all great figures, death did not silence her, transformed her. For in Istanbul, legends began to bloom like roses around her memory, each petal carrying whispers of who she had been, who she might have been, and what she had left behind. Her mosques became her voice. The Üsküdar Mosque, gazing across the Bosphorus, and the Topkapi Mosque, standing sentinel on the city's walls, were not just monuments, they were symbols. Pilgrims walked their courtyards and murmured stories of their patroness, the princess who had bent an empire with gifts and grit. But in the markets, the whispers were more daring. They spoke of her relationship with Mimar Sinan, the empire's greatest architect. Some claimed that Sinan, struck by her beauty and intelligence, had loved her in silence. They told of how he designed her mosques with hidden messages, aligning their minarets with the setting sun and the rising moon on her birthday, cosmic tribute to the woman named Sun and Moon. Was it true? Or was it the people's way of explaining the unmatched beauty of his work? History leaves us uncertain, but the myth endured, growing brighter with each retelling. And in myth, Mihrimah became more than a princess, she became eternal. Her political legacy was just as complex. Scholars argued over her role in the fall of Mustafa, the doomed son of Suleiman. Was she the silent hand behind his execution, sacrificing a beloved prince to secure her mother's bloodline? Some said yes. Others claimed she merely acted as her mother's tool. But even in accusation, one truth stood firm. Mihrimah's name was inseparable from the survival of her dynasty to her allies. She was the savior of Selim's reign, the protector of the throne, the woman who poured her fortune into rebuilding fleets, paying armies, financing campaigns when her brother faltered. To her enemies, she was proof of the corruption of the harem, a princess who meddled in affairs beyond her place. But perhaps her greatest legacy lay in what she represented. For Mihrimah was not an empress, not a sultana regnant. She never sat upon the throne, yet she bent it all the same. She showed that the power of women in the Ottoman court was not a mere shadow, not a whisper behind latticed screens, but a force that shaped wars, decided succession, and carved monuments of stone and faith, even centuries later. When the Ottoman Empire itself had crumbled into memory, her name endured in Istanbul's skyline. Travelers crossing the Bosphorus looked up at her mosque, its domes glowing in the light, and asked, "Who was this princess?" And the locals would answer with pride or with awe, "Mihrimah Sultan, the daughter of Suleiman, the princess who gave her wealth, her life, her very soul to the empire." If you were there, centuries after her death, standing in Üsküdar as the call to prayer rose from her mosque, would you have felt her presence? Would you have believed the legend that the sun and the moon still aligned on her birthday, as if the heavens themselves bowed to her memory? Yet legend alone could not define her. The empire she left behind was not the golden empire of her father. It was fractured. And so, in her memory, another question grew. Had Mihrimah delayed the fall, or had she merely disguised it? Did her gifts and grit keep the dynasty alive, or did they only mask the rot? That question haunted later generations. For every sultana who dared to influence politics, for every woman who rose in the Ottoman court, Mihrimah's story was invoked sometimes as inspiration, sometimes as warning. Her afterlife in legend was not gentle, but it was enduring. She was remembered as both saint and schemer, savior and conspirator, daughter and ruler. Perhaps that is the mark of true power, to be remembered not as one thing, but as many, to resist being reduced to a single role, and still. One more chapter remained, the final reflection on what her life truly meant, not only to the Ottomans, but to us. History does not always remember with kindness. For every emperor carved in stone, there are countless daughters, wives, and sisters whose names are brushed aside. Yet Mihrimah Sultan, centuries after her death, still refuses to fade. She endures in the skyline of Istanbul, in the myths of her people, in the debates of scholars, and in the question of women and power that stretches across time. Walk the city today and you will see her. At Üsküdar, her mosque rises, white stone gleaming against the Bosphorus. Across the waters, at Topkapi, her second mosque watches the old land walls, guardian of the city. Together they form a silent dialogue across the city, one that whispers her name with each call to prayer. These were not the works of a passive princess. They were the deliberate monuments of a woman who knew legacy was built in stone. But her legacy is more than architecture. It is the story of endurance in a world that tried to confine her. Mihrimah lived in an empire where women did not rule openly, yet she bent the empire from behind the veil. She funded campaigns, shaped succession, rebuilt fleets, and counseled sultans. When men faltered, she stepped forward. When the empire stumbled, she held it steady with her gifts and her grit. And yet, history gave her no crown. She was never empress. She was never sovereign. She was remembered not in chronicles of conquest, but in whispers of influence. Perhaps that is why her story grips us so fiercely today, for in her we see not the spectacle of kingship, but the subtler, quieter forms of power, the kind that bends history without being seen. Her afterlife is tangled with legend. Did Sinan truly love her, aligning her mosques with the sun and moon as a secret tribute? Or was it simply the people's longing for poetry in stone? Did she truly engineer Mustafa's death, securing Selim's rise? Or was she merely the daughter caught in her mother's designs? We cannot know for certain, but the very fact that we still ask tells us her power was real. And her relevance is not just Ottoman, it is universal. In every dynasty, in every age, there are women like Mihrimah, women who shape the fates of nations without wearing crowns. Their stories are often hidden, rewritten, or diminished, yet they are the invisible architects of history. If you were there, walking through Topkapi in her final years, seeing her aged but unbowed, would you have recognized her as one of the empire's true rulers? Or would you, like so many men of her age, have dismissed her as merely a daughter, a wife, a sister? And here lies the forbidden truth. The Ottoman Empire's greatness did not rest only on the shoulders of men who wore the sword. It also rested on the unseen hands of women like Mihrimah. To forget her is to forget the balance of the empire itself. Her story matters today because it reminds us that power is not always where it appears to be. It is not only in crowns or titles, but in influence, endurance, the quiet ability to bend the course of events with gifts, with words, with sheer determination. In our world, where questions of gender and power still echo, Mihrimah Sultan's life is not a relic. It is a mirror. She was the daughter of Suleiman the Magnificent, the child of Hürrem Sultan, the wife of a grand vizier, the sister of a weak sultan. But she was also something greater, the sun and moon of the Ottoman Empire, the princess who bent an empire with gifts and grit. And that is why her story must be told, not as a footnote to her father's greatness, but as a legacy in its own right. For centuries have passed, empires have risen and fallen, yet her name still lingers, her mosques still stand, and her legend still burns.